He was the sort of pilot who could read a sky the way other men read a newspaper, head tilted a fraction, eyes narrowed, measuring the spread of cloud like paragraphs and listening to wind as if weather had a voice. On the evening of September 14th, 1983, Robert Hale swung the nose of his single-engine Cessna 210 toward the north-northeast and climbed out of a small strip south of Tucson with crates of gear for a mine near Flagstaff. The strip lights were already humming in the heat. The air smelled like dust and avgas. The tower, really just a shack and a radio, cleared him with the bored kindness of people who have seen too many takeoffs to be precious about any one of them. Hale's voice on the frequency was unhurried. 92 Charlie off Wilcox, climbing through 4,000, looking good ahead. He tapped the altimeter, leveled his wings, and rode the warm elastic of late summer air into the high desert. He never called again. 15 minutes after he lifted, the radar picture changed. A monsoon cell, born in the ugly blue north of the Catalina Mountains, thickened and then inhaled. The forecasters would later say outflow boundaries stacked on outflow boundaries, a jawful of wind biting down on the Mogollon Rim and spitting up a wall of dust. Lightning began to map its own country above the Verde Valley. Controllers in Albuquerque Center watched a green smear grow across Hale's route and start to boil. They keyed their mics. Nothing. At 6:47 p.m., the transponder returned tagged N92C jittered once and went flat. The scope showed rain, then more rain, then nothing at all. No mayday. No scratchy last sentence. Just silence and the old coordinates of a plan that now had a hole where a man should be. Robert Hale was 52 that summer. Colorado farm boy, Air Force transport pilot at 19. A man who had learned in Southeast Asia what a runway looked like when there was more mud than runway. He came home unable to live without the geometry of flight, so he bought a tired Cessna with a patchwork of rivet lines like scars and gave it a name he never painted on the fuselage, the boat, as if air were water and he liked the lie that made. He flew loads the highways could not be trusted with. Mining parts, veterinary supplies, sacks of mail that would otherwise take 2 days down Tulane roads. He had a trailer with a swamp cooler and maps pinned to every wall. He kept his logbooks the way other men keep diaries, block letters tight as fence wire. People said he was a loner, but not the kind who made silence a weapon. He could spend an hour on a diner stool without speaking and then say something that landed like a tool in a palm, useful and exactly the right weight. He had been married once. No one agreed on how long, and no one could remember him being unkind about it ending. The sky was his second wife, the same friends joked, though they learned later the joke didn't age well. What he loved about flying wasn't escape so much as accuracy. Wind has rules if you respect the math. So does desert light, if you stare at it long enough to see how it arranges itself on stone. That afternoon the math turned mean. Hale filed a VFR plan with direct, drawn like a golf pencil line up from the Tucson Basin and across 100 miles of dry high country, with Prescott as a wet ink alternate and Winslow as a distant mentee of a notion if the world refused to cooperate. He checked the forecast in a windowless office where air felt old and paper newer. The briefer said what briefers say when late summer wants to pretend it is spring. Isolated to scattered cells. Virga, outflow. You know the drill. Hale did. I'll be home before they get serious, he said, and the briefer told his friend later that if the line had belonged to anyone else, he'd have called it optimism. He lifted into heat that shook like a dog washing itself dry. Below him the desert spread in the clean grammar of evening. Mesas like punctuation, a ribbon of interstate, headlights seeking each other with the stubbornness of need. He recognized the half-honest sky to the north, sunlight on one plane, and, not far beyond it, that ugly bruise the desert paints when the monsoon wakes up hungover and willing to fight. He had 100 decisions he could make in those minutes. He kept going because the world still looked like a solvable equation. The storm arranged itself with the speed of a rumor and the certainty of a verdict. Outflow rolled ahead of the rain like a new law. Dust reared in a wall. Lightning stitched down in long, theatrical seams that the ground pretended to ignore. Somewhere over the Black Hills, Hale pitched the nose to climb above it and ran into air that didn't want him there. The microburst that shoved him down was a fist wearing a glove. Albuquerque Center tried him again on guard. November 9-2 Charlie, say position. Above Cottonwood, a family camping on Forest Road 525 heard a propeller thrash, then all at once not. A trucker southbound on I-17 told his radio later it sounded like somebody turned the sky off. The search began before the storm finished scolding the land. By 10 that night, Civil Air Patrol planes were on the ramp in Prescott, pilots stabbing grease pencils into plastic overlay maps to draw grids across an area that looked manageable only when it was paper. The sheriff's office in Yavapai County pulled deputies from their days off, put them in Broncos, and sent them to the mouths of canyons like ushers at the door of an unruly church. The Forest Service called in a helicopter from a fire crew, rotor wash blowing grit into eyes, a slow ballet above a dark country not inclined to let itself be read by strangers. They found nothing. Not even the black kiss of a scar, where aluminum marries sandstone badly. The rain had cleaned the desert as if it were a criminal and a mother both. Days smudged into one another the way new maps blur where no one has walked enough to make one path brighter than another. Air Patrol pilots flew their rectangles slow and dirty, eyes red with the particular exhaustion you can only earn by trying to see what doesn't want to be seen. Ground teams walked washes that smelled like pennies and damp creosote, listening for a sound that wouldn't be a human voice because a human voice in that weather would be a fairy tale. They found a length of wire. They found a soft hat. They found a beer can that could have been from that day or a year earlier because the desert is kind to aluminum and lies about time. The witnesses did their work, the way witnesses do, with confidence that eroded the closer you got them to specificity. A rancher near Camp Verde swore he saw a white streak dive behind a mesa and not come out, then admitted he'd been looking through heat shimmer, then said he'd been, right where you are now, officer, and the deputy standing where he was nodded, as if geography could absolve memory. A group of teenagers in Sedona said they'd watched a light skip across the top of Cathedral Rock that wasn't lightning, that it moved wrong, that it stuttered and then vanished, that they screamed for fun and then screamed in a different register. A pilot on final into Flagstaff reported nothing at all unusual. A miner in Jerome said he heard an engine cough like a smoker's throat and then a sound he refused to evaluate. By day 12, the county ledger was sweating. Search and rescue is a line item until it becomes a line in a story. The official operation stood down. The sheriff read a sentence into a microphone that sounded like the last 20 such sentences he had read, and not like any of them, because saying a thing aloud is a way of cheating yourself into believing it has been settled. The FAA filled out a file. Missing aircraft presumed destroyed. The YLT had never been heard. Someone said maybe the antenna snapped at impact. Someone else said maybe the beacon was one of those older units stubborn as donkeys. The family, what there was of it. A cousin near Benson, a brother who wouldn't come to the phone, signed whatever a clerk needed signed to close a cabinet. Hale's trailer emptied like a lung. The cousin boxed the charts, kept a mug that said clouds are my mountains, and threw out a set of cracked headphones. The logbooks, the neat columns of time, fuel, remarks, went into a banker's box. In the last one, the September 14th line stopped mid-page. TUS, FLG VFR, cargo, 1700L, and then nothing. As if a man could simply refuse to finish writing his own sentence, and the world would have to live with the run-on. Stories did not stop, because people don't. He was seen in Hermosillo, working a crop duster. He was seen in Kingman, older, with a beard, talking to a waitress about weather as if he were hiding in plain speech. A woman claimed he had faked his death to ditch debt. A man said smugglers ran him to ground. A radio show tucked him into a broadcast about lights that move as if they have an opinion. What the desert kept without commentary. Between the Mogollon Rim and the Verde, there are canyons that don't remember the word road. Flash floods carve new letters every year. Overhangs fold into themselves like hands. There are places where a plane could come down and never be looked at by anything with a badge or a checklist. There are box canyons so tight a helicopter can hover over them like an argument and see only shadow. 30 years is how long it took for accident and curiosity to choose the same afternoon. March 2013, a Friday with the sun behaving well enough to make 4 friends from Phoenix overconfident. They wanted a canyon they couldn't pronounce. They had a topo map that still wore the colors of the Reagan years and a GPS that kept insisting the trail they were on did not exist. A storm 2 weeks earlier had rearranged the season's debris, thrown cottonwood limbs into knots, and emptied sand out of places it had been storing it for a decade. The friends, 2 engineers, a nurse, and a man who had promised himself he'd finally start writing again if only he could find a place quiet enough, followed a wash until it narrowed into sandstone walls that leaned in like elders. They climbed a shelf that insisted they not, dropped their packs, and turned the corner into a throat of stone. It wasn't obvious all at once. There was a shape, wrong color for rock, wrong angle for tree. Something cylindrical, tail cone, and the ribbed suggestion of flaps. The plane sat at a tilt as if embarrassed, nose bitten into talus, right wing chewed by time, left wing pressed up under an overhang like an arm pulled over a face. A small juniper had grown under the wing and sought light there the way the poor seek windows. The paint had given up being blue and white and had gone over to chalk. Dust had become skin. By the time the 4 were close enough to see the tail number, in 92C, they had already decided it was a ghost. The cockpit glass was cracked in the pretty spiderweb way old glass cracks. The door on the pilot's side was jammed against rock. The door on the right was buckled. Inside, the seatbelt still crossed a body that had become bone and posture. The headset lay crooked, the coiled cord still reaching for a jack, as if it could negotiate the old conversation. In the right seat, A book with swollen pages, a pilot's log, its cover stained dark with years of varnish-colored rain. They stood there longer than a photograph would suggest. They stood there until language could be included. One said, Jesus. One said, Holy. One said nothing and sat on a rock and put his head down between his knees in the old athlete's trick against fainting. The nurse counted his breaths and decided to let him be. They hiked out, finding service higher up on a ridge where cacti held little white flowers that had the gall to be cheerful. The dispatcher took their story with the tone dispatchers inherit from priests. A sheriff's helicopter came in at an angle, backed away, tried again, and could not see the plane until the pilot hung the ship practically on its tail and looked straight down into the canyon's throat. For 3 days the canyon argued with rotors and ropes, and, finally, grudgingly allowed men and canvas to touch what it had owned. The work after a discovery like that feels both like a sacrament and like crime scene cleanup. Deputies taped off a circle no one wanted to cross. A state investigator in a ball cap and a shirt with the unconvincing words public information explained that yes, they believed the aircraft was from 1983. Yes, they believed a Robert Hale had been at the controls. Yes, they believed they would have to cut the fuselage in three to get it skyward. A volunteer climber who had thought his weekends would be for summits hung in space and eased a stretcher through a window that had once been a windshield, his hands gentle in a way the canyon noticed and did not comment on. Forensics builds a story from the four corners in and then argues with itself over the middle. The YLT antenna was snapped off at the base, a break consistent with the way the fuselage had flexed. The beacon itself was old enough to have moods. The altimeter had frozen at 5,200 feet. The fuel selectors were on both. The mixture was rich. The prop blades were bent in a way old men in hangars will tell you means the engine was still turning when it met stone. On the left wing, rivets had the bloom, small erupted moons, of a lightning strike exit. The control yoke was forward as if someone had been trying to pitch for air with nothing but hope to grab. In the baggage compartment, a flare kit, unfired, a signal mirror, scratched, a canteen, empty, an oil-stained rag, folded as if someone had been trying to keep neat in a room that had stopped caring about neat. The pilot's skeleton told a mercifully unmelodramatic truth. He had broken ribs you would expect to be broken by that kind of arrival, and none of the ones that meant the heart would be in a hurry to stop. The headset's band had left a line in dust on a skull that took the shape of a man who used to think with his jaw. The seatbelts were latched. There was a pencil clipped to the yoke and a note card on the right knee tray that had grown limp with time and still held a few words in a hand that made even fear into block letters. Down in canyon. Engine rough. Storm above. No climb. We'll wait. RH. Later, on a logbook page nearer the back, day 2. Sky clear. No one saw. Water bad. And then, faint enough that a lab scanner had to pull it up. If found, tell them I stayed with the ship. The press loved him for that sentence. The old, low-wage nobility of it. For a week the evening news found its most solemn tie. The PIO read from a paper, and the sentence went around the world, and then came back with edits. A woman who said she had gone to school with Hale in Colorado wrote a letter to the editor that claimed he had always been the kind of boy who straightened chairs. A man who had once unloaded mining equipment from the Cessna showed a photograph to a reporter and said, "He shook your hand like he meant it." A cousin drove up from Benson and sat in the sheriff's lobby with a smile that looked taped on. He said he wrote everything down, which, coming from a family of people who fix things with spare parts, was not an insult. The county cut the Cessna into liftable chunks and winched them out with a small helicopter that behaved like a penitent. The airframe went first, then the engine, then the torn wing with the lightning bloom. Ropes made the canyon look like a spider had decided to organize the rock. The pieces were laid in an impound under tarps while the FAA ran through its catechism. The skeleton, collected with the tenderness you can teach but cannot insure, went to the medical examiner and then to a ceremony at the Veterans Cemetery where a chaplain said words about wings and shelter that would have been corny anywhere else and were not corny there. 2 cousins, a woman with a weathered face who had shared shift coffee with Hale, and the 4 hikers stood in a line and watched a flag fold itself into geometry. The canyon went back to being a canyon. You can hike there if you work at it, and if you don't mind trusting your ankles to sandstone that likes to change its mind. There is a pale scuff on one wall where a nose cone gave up momentum. Somebody sometimes leaves a paper plane there, tucked into a crack. Somebody once left a pilot's wings pin with the enamel rubbed off. In a week it had vanished into a pocket of rock or a pocket of a boy, and either way that was fair. For those who count such things, the lessons were clear in a way lessons like this almost never are. Outflow boundaries don't announce themselves. Microbursts can talk to you like a friend and then push you off the porch. A box canyon is an insult in a language even good pilots sometimes pretend they don't understand. YLTs break. Radios die in stone throats. A man can be under a highway of search grids and still be a rumor. For those who live for metaphor, there were other lessons, the kind that get made into coffee mugs. Don't pick a fight with weather. Don't trust a map more than a cloud. Stay with the ship, unless the ship is wrong. The men who had flown grids in '83 brought lawn chairs to the edge of an airshow that June and talked like baseball fans. One said he'd taken his CAP crew right over that canyon 3 times. Another said we need better eyes and then laughed because he had the humility to know the sentence was both true and stupid. A woman who had learned to fly freight in the '90s read the logbook lines online and said, to no one in particular, I would have tied a shirt to a wing and prayed. And someone answered, he probably did, because hope is a habit too. In Tucson, a small airport restaurant put a framed copy of the last logbook line by the register. The waitress told new pilots the story the way a mother tells a child to look both ways, and the pilots, young and a little arrogant because you have to be to get very far in a machine heavier than the air around it, nodded and said they would, as if that settled it. In Flagstaff, a museum with more volunteers than funding put the Cessna's yoke in a glass case and a label that didn't romanticize and didn't scold. A kid stood there and looked at the yoke for a longer time than kids usually give anything that isn't a screen. His father read the words about storms and made a non-committal noise that was really the sound grown men make when they are moved and don't have the tolerance for naming it. What actually happened in those hours after Hale wrote Will Wait is a narrower story the canyon keeps. He may have tried a handheld radio. The canyon walls would have laughed. He may have fired a flare and watched it bounce light off stone and fall into the mouth of shade. He may have flashed the mirror to patchwork sky. A plane may have flown overhead in the high hours of the next day, ignorant and innocent. He may have rationed water the way the manual recommends, not too fast, not too stubborn, and watched the sun crawl the walls like slow fire. There is a kind of courage that is neither dramatic nor invisible. The closest word we have is patience. Every disappearance generates the thin, toxic rumor that the person wanted to go. People told it about Hale with the same confidence they tell weather 3 days out. The logbook ends that kind of talk cleanly. Tell them I stayed with the ship. If there is a religion of work, that is a verse. Let the desert have its mysteries without borrowing a man's character to make them more entertaining. There were loose ends. There always are. The mind that had ordered the parts sent a representative to the sheriff's office to ask, with genuine embarrassment, whether their crates had been recovered. They had not. A canyon keeps what it wants to keep. An insurance company found the file and called Hale's cousin with a voice from the '80s asking if she could send documentation of death, and she said, very calmly, he was buried. And the clerk said, very evenly, thank you, ma'am. And the call ended because some loops closed neatly. An old girlfriend, if that's what she had been, mailed a photograph of Hale in a cheap suit to the museum with a note. He hated ties, but wore one to my sister's wedding. The museum kept the note and put the photograph in a file, because curation is just another word for making room for other people's attempts at meaning. On the anniversary, the hikers returned to the canyon and brought a small metal tag on which one had stamped September 14th, '83 by hand. They left it under a stone at the base of the pale scuff. They didn't tell anyone about it because gestures don't work if you brag at them. On a different day, a pilot taking a student through power-off stalls west of Camp Verde looked at a row of cumulus with the old suspicion and said, not today, and angled for Prescott to drink coffee instead. The student told friends later that his instructor was a coward. 10 years later, in weather not half as pretty, that student turned around himself because the older man's sentence had hatched in his head at the right moment. In a town that has grown up around runways, people tell the story of Robert Hale the way they tell stories about late trains and favorite teachers, and that time the river jumped its banks. The sheriff keeps a photocopy of the logbook page in a drawer he opens to find paper clips. The briefer at flight service, different office, same windowless air, says, when a pilot comes in asking about monsoons in September, you'll get out and you'll get back if you don't try to thread the needle. A mechanic in a hangar points at a row of Yelty antennae on a shelf and says, with the politeness sarcasm sometimes wears, you might consider an upgrade. The desert keeps its habits. Wind, light, the long, slow work of removing the specific and leaving behind the archetype. And the canyon? It still hides. That is its vocation. There are hours when light lays across the ledges and turns sandstone into new currency. There are days when the only sound is a raven negotiating with itself. Stand there long enough and you will hear your name in the noises water makes as it dries, and you will feel foolish and like a prophet at the same time. You will think of a man alone in a cockpit, his hand